case of the European Court of Human Rights, education. It was the famous Belgian linguistic case, and one of the core sentences was a definition of education. There is a library written on just the notion of education, different from instruction, from teaching, and so on and so on. Education. Education means, according to that case, the transfer of values, beliefs, and convictions. Wow. So that was the first interpretation of that court. And what does that mean for the topic we are dealing? You know, religion in education is a very prominent issue and chapter in education law handbooks. And education is a very prominent chapter in constitutional law, administrative law. So, and those who have some expertise on utriusque juris, on both laws, also in canon law and education and religion, is one of the most favorite topics for research and for writers. So let's move quickly to the first session. Again, we're so happy to have all those experts and from all kinds of faculties, but definitely Jeroen, we welcome you because we did not know each other that much, but it's good to become familiar with your thoughts and with your writings. Please, you have the floor.
Thanks so much. Thanks to the organizers. Indeed, we just happily got acquainted, Jan and myself. But Stijn, I know for I think for a decade or so, always by way of email, Zoom, various book projects, conference projects. The first thing I learned at this conference is that Stijn is not a very smart AI entity, but he's actually a very smart real person, and very happy to see you in the flesh. Yes, so Sir Malcolm has charisma, but I have pictures, so I brought some pictures, you know, just you have to balance yourself again, I suppose. And I gave it this very non-neutral title, and in fact, this shall be my pulpit today. My very non-neutral mission today shall be to almost take an evangelical proselytizing approach to the Toledo Guiding Principles. The Toledo Guiding Principles actually having been prepared by an early panel of the OSCE panel of experts on religious freedom, including Sir Malcolm. Back then, they got up to very, very cool things. The current members, Marilyn and myself, nowhere near that type of fireworks, unfortunately. So my objective really is to kind of upgrade the Toledo Guiding Principles on teaching about religions in the public school framework. And when I say Toledo Guiding Principles, I really mean any kind of pluralist approach to teaching about religions in public schools. It could also be, you know, referring to the EU REDCO project or the Council of Europe resolutions on pluralist teaching. I mean pluralist teaching on matters of religion within the public school framework. But for the sake of argument, and because it's such a nice brief acronym, TGP shall be used today, Toledo Guiding Principles. So in the next 10 minutes or so, 15 minutes, or by the time Stijn ruthlessly cuts me off, I will be engaging in a hyper-consequentialist exercise of reasoning myself precisely to that point of upgrading the Toledo Guiding Principles. And anyone who has, you know, scanned some of my scribblings knows that I made a profession out of consequentialist reasoning. So this shall be no different. So three prisms, three approaches: international relations, international law, and social legal studies. And yeah, my attempt shall be by using the first two perspectives to show that I think international relations and international law are kind of conspiring against the Toledo Guiding Principles, if you wish to believe that. Whereas there's an opening, I think, for Toledo Guiding Principle kind of teaching when we're looking at social legal data. International relations then. I think you might kind of categorize teaching about religion or religious teaching in schools in this kind of spectrum, going from the more religious to the more public, if you will. I'm not dealing with denominational schools today, so the private realm here on the left-hand side. You can imagine there are denominational schools with religious entry requirements and those without, begging a host of different human rights issues, but I won't be dealing with that. We're dealing with the right-hand side of the spectrum, the public side, where you can imagine public schools with religious instruction, some of them with opt-out modalities, others without opt-outs, but also public schools with no religious instruction, but teaching about religion, precisely like the Toledo guidelines want or aspire to do, and again with opt-outs or without opt-outs. I wasn't really sure about the order there at the public side, but potentially you could also swap these. Now, from an international relations side, first of all, let's be very clear. These are ideal types, and there's an awful lot more to say in practice. The public-private divide is much more obscure. Take Ireland, where under the constitution, the national schools are mandated to operate as schools, but run in practice by church boards. So the national schools are in practice very much religious schools, so that things get very obscure there. Also in practice, many types are not mutually exclusive. You can perfectly have religious instruction and Toledo guiding principles operating within both a public school and a private school. But moving then to the international relations side of things there, main message there should be that if any model is permitted, then the right-hand side of the spectrum is least attractive to states with dominant churches. I mean, it's if the default may as well be religious instruction, then why bother even trying to make the Toledo guiding principles a success? I mean, the failure would actually suit dominant churches probably better than actively contributing to that, right? So the key stakeholders there do not have an interest in making the Toledo guiding principles style teaching the default options, as long as anything there in the middle is also perfectly permissible. So we end up with something that I call like the perverse incentive. There's a perverse incentive going on there, whereby making something that is very much pluralism conducive, making that into a failure is of interest to one of the key stakeholders there in the whole enterprise there. So I'm moving from that very oversimplifying conclusion on the international relations side to international law that pretty much corroborates this issue. So under international law, then I'm not going to bore you with all the different the different standards applicable here, but yes, there's access to education principles and freedom of religion principles, but things get really interesting when we zoom in on the parental liberties. So this notion that parents, as part of either religious freedom or as part of the right to education, temporarily decide things for their young children. Now, if you look at the standards applicable to education and religion, again, I'm not going to zoom in much on the denominational side, but there the standards are very clear, and basically they say the states back off. This is well protected, well charted, and protected territory, and very well entrenched within international human rights law that there's a private realm where denominational schools or frameworks outside the public system are well protected by freedom of religion standards. At the public side, standards are more profound, more far-reaching, combination of positive and negative obligations, avoiding discrimination, creating sufficient access to public schools, which also actually does make, for instance, the Irish example problematic, because if there is not enough access to public school education, even if there's a demand, then the justification of saying, well, this is how we've done this for centuries, or these are church prerogatives, or this is how we do things, or this is how we've always done things, do not justify that anymore. And that's then even aside from things like perpetuating segregation or fostering segregation and other concerns raised by monitoring bodies. At the public, I skip forward to the public side again of the spectrum. I think one way of summarizing all those standards that are operational in this area is saying that the state fulfills its human rights obligations if it either creates a public schools framework, including a public school curriculum that is designedly neutral or objective, pluralistic, designedly non-denominational. And the magical words are: knowledge must be transmitted in a critical, objective, and pluralistic way. So either if it does this designedly, and if and to the extent that this is not possible for reasons of church prerogatives, for reasons of history, for other reasons, then there must be sufficient opt-outs for parents and pupils to be exempted from those parts of the curriculum that are more coercive, religiously coercive, or otherwise are not critical and objective and pluralistic. So this is kind of the convoluted magical formula that is applied by most monitoring bodies, including the European Court of Human Rights and as well as the UN committees. So if you apply that then to the spectrum, and again, let's not deal with the private realm, let's deal with the public realm, you see that there's only one modality that's really off limits: public schools with religious instruction without opt-outs. I mean, this really clearly bumps into that opt-out rule. That's the Fulgaro, that's Hassan Selgin, and so forth. But the others, they're in the middle, they're perfectly fine. Also, public schools with religious instruction with opt-outs is perfectly sanctioned, permitted by international law. I think things are a little bit tricky towards the far right end of the spectrum. How about TGP-style education with no opt-outs? There, you could argue that if that kind of teaching does not run into the first prong of the test, i.e., it doesn't breach the objective, pluralist, and so forth test, then we do not need opt-outs. We do not need to go to the second prong. And it's something to that effect is stated in landmark cases to the effect that parents cannot object to those parts of the curriculum that are perfectly objective and pluralistic, because if we were to allow that, then it would be that would be the end of public school education, period. So again, massively oversimplifying, the international law approach to all of this supports that same perverse incentive that we saw under international relations. It doesn't go all the way for pluralistic education. It doesn't take sides. It doesn't stick up for pluralism there. But it sanctions. It permits a number of modalities that, if they're all permitted, then there's very, very little incentive for stakeholders to make pluralist education the default. Then the last angle, social legal studies, and Stein just instructed me that I should be very, very short here. There, essentially the message here is opt-outs in social legal studies, qualitative studies. Opt-outs are not a wholesale solution to the problem of religious coercion. Opt-outs are the problem. Opt-outs are part of the problem of religious instruction within public schools. There are a couple of very down-to-earth issues. Religion tends to be very much integrated into larger parts of the curriculum rather than an isolated, insular one-off where you can easily be opted out. Opt-outs are not universally applicable in some countries like Turkey. People are not informed about their rights. This is true for Italy, for Poland, and a number of other countries. This is all the European Court jurisprudence. But this is still the European Court trying to fix a system that cannot be fixed, because there are also more fundamental, more systemic issues underlying opt-outs, which very much have to do with identity issues, bullying of the opted out child. So here the idea is, you know, the opted out child and the parents still need to be proactive, step up to the school, say, hey, we are different. We do not wish what apparently is the mainstream religion in this country. We want something else. And again, this should be underscored that this is the public realm. So there's something fundamentally off in those dynamics. Those social legal studies also corroborate a number of concerns that were there already in theory, namely the opted out child could be bullied. This is significant in some of these studies, but what is even more significant is that the opted out child suffers identity issues, wonders, why can't I be with my friends, with my peers in that classroom? Why am I different? Why are my parents weird? What do my parents want with me? Taking these discussions home, also to the dinner table, causing all sort of familial little mini crises. Again, part of the opt-out and exemption system. So through the lens of social legal studies, then we can strike off the opt-out solutions. Opt-outs are not a remedy. Opt-outs are part of the problem. So that leaves us then with TGP style teaching, pluralist teaching about religion in the public school, and that the only real choice then is, should there be opt-outs? And on the basis of the same kind of social legal studies, you would not want opt-outs there, but there's some degree of coercion, say, forcing this down everybody's throat, obviously. So I think there the human rights argument is very much contained in the CRC, in the Children's Rights Convention, which basically says education is not neutral. Public school education comes with an agenda. It comes with a human rights agenda. It prepares the pupil for a responsible life in society with respect for democracy, rule of law, and human rights. And I think so by way of a conclusion then, this could be the ultimate argument for TGP-style teaching, perhaps without opt-outs. So I cannot make it any more controversial than that. I leave it at that. Thanks very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Jeroen. I would love to start now to comment on the questions, but unfortunately that is not my role. So we will do that later on, I guess. Of course, there are still some other examples, and again, we should refer now to the Belgian constitution, where we try to have religious instruction in several religions within the public school. Mostly based on the technique of recognition of the religion, and also non-confessional model and religious so-called religious instruction. So there are some variety, and again, comparative law will help us again to be inspired. But for the debate later on, I guess there will be food on the table. Let's quickly go now to I don't know if Angelika, so our colleagues and friends from University of Cologne. Is Angelika online? Angelika and Cathérine, but Angelika, do we have her? Yes, wonderful, great. Angelika, thank you so much for being with us, a prominent member of the University of Cologne and also the founder of the Academy of European Human Rights. We are honored to have you on screen, and yes, you have the floor. between brackets.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Top.
Yeah, okay. Then a warm welcome from Cologne, and I'm sad that I cannot come, but the virus has invaded me and I had to stay home for 10 days. It's the last day of my isolation. Today we want to present a paper together with Cathérine Van de Graaf, and she is with you. So I just want to say some introductory words on our topic. Neutrality and religious dress symbols in public schools. And actually, I think we want to go back with what we explained to the first panel, and I even want to take up one point from the keynote. In the keynote, Malcolm Evans used some expressions I just noted down because I found it so interesting to link it to our intervention. He said, the state is taking a view, or he said, the state is entitled to make a judgment. To take it word by word, it's somehow strange, because how is the state, the abstractum, the state, taking a view? Only people can take a view. A state as an abstractum cannot take a view. And actually, this is the perspective that we want to take as a starting point to look closer at state neutrality as a fiction. Because and to see the human rights problems mirrored in this fiction, because we think that this is an important point. Usually you would talk about, on the one hand, neutrality of the state, and on the other hand, freedom of religion, and you would have this basic opposition state-individual. But as a matter of fact, this opposition is not a true one, because the state is made up of individuals. So the abstraction does not really exist, but there are also individuals having their human rights. And that's why all that is a very complex interrelationship. If you remember the picture of the state of Hobbes' Leviathan, it's perfectly expressing this dichotomy, or this problem you have. On the one hand, when you look from far away, you see just the state as one great, one big figure. But if you go closer, you see all the individuals. And that's the perspective we want to take, to zoom on the individuals in this fiction about the state and its neutrality. Because if you can say the state as a whole is neutral, or as Malcolm Evans has discussed, taking neutral decisions or not taking such decisions, when you look at the concrete individuals, they cannot be neutral. It's just not possible. And that's true for all those who are teaching or those who are judging. And then we have the different judgments in the different courts, where some allow these prohibitions of expressing views for the individuals, like the judgment of the Second Senate of the German Federal Constitutional Court about the judges, or Dachlab versus Switzerland, whereas we also have the more nuanced approach of the First Senate of the Federal Constitutional Court, not allowing such prohibitions per se. So what we want to stress is this link between the fiction of neutrality and transparency. When I say it's impossible for a person to be neutral, then I allude to the definition of religious freedom in the convention. The court, the European Court of Human Rights, defines freedom of religion, I quote, as freedom to hold or not to hold religious beliefs, and to practice or not to practice a religion, and explains that it makes up the identity of believers and their conception of life, and that is decisive for atheists, agnostics, skeptics, and the unconcerned. So that covers all. Everybody will find him or herself somewhere in this definition. It does not leave a lacuna. So you cannot stay outside. Either you are one or you are the other. If you are not very decided, you are still something. And just to give you an example, in many constitutions, we have the possibility of the oath formula to add, so God help me. So either you add it or you don't, but not to add it is also an expression of something. So in this sense, to expect people working for the state or representing the state to be neutral cannot mean that they would not have any opinions or any convictions anymore, but what it basically means is for them to make a clear distinctions between the private and the public. In private, they will be able to go to church, to confess their religion, but in public, when working for the state, they cannot. And that is important. They cannot show these convictions, but that doesn't mean that they wouldn't have them. It's just they can't show them. And in this sense, this whole concept of neutrality is closely linked to a lack of transparency, because not showing does not mean not having, but concealing, as a matter of fact. The most obvious expression is wearing a uniform. When you wear a uniform, you pretend not to be somehow individual in your thoughts and ideas. And that's, for example, typical for judges, that they wear their robes in order to be seen, not as individuals, but as representing something different. But still, the problem is hiding the fact that convictions, opinions exist, and that whatever you do, teach, or judge is never completely abstract. So all these convictions will always flow in. Against this background, I think there are some justifications for upholding this fiction of neutrality, and we have to see the fiction of neutrality runs through the whole jurisprudence. I want to just name three motives. The first reason for this fiction of neutrality is to create trust in not being discriminated against. Whoever comes in contact with somebody representing the state and sees him or her with a symbol or showing a specific belief might be afraid that if he or she has a different one, might not be treated in the same way. So in order to not to have the subjective feeling of someone being in contact with the state to be discriminated against, we have this fiction of neutrality that convictions of those working for the state are hidden. Second, it's also, and that also comes up in a lot of jurisprudence, the idea is a trust in not being indoctrinated. That is what we find in all these cases about schools with little children, that you want to trust that your children are not indoctrinated. That's behind this idea of the teachers of young children with a headscarf, the prohibition for these headscarves. And the third reason, and that was already alluded to quite often, is the historical experience. We have states where that is, like in France, a basic principle of the constitution out of historical experience, that at some time it was feared that religion would take over the state, and that was a reaction, and that reaction is written in the constitution and is like a pillar of the whole state. We have it similarly in Turkey or in Switzerland probably as well. So this is now this model of the neutrality as a fiction. We do have an opposite model, and the opposite model would be built on transparency, just not saying we hide, but we balance our convictions. That would mean that we openly allow people to confess them, but we expect them to have an equilibrium. And that's, for example, what we also see in the selection of judges. You can have a system where you pretend that they are completely neutral, that they are like blackboards where nothing is written on. But you can also have selection procedures like in Switzerland, where you say you have to have a party affiliation and you have to make it clear that if you are on the right or on the left side, and then we choose people in order to have a balance. So this is completely the opposite. We don't hide, but we try to aim at some sort of equilibrium in representing the state. And that's, in our view, the background now for all these cases about religious school symbols in public schools, where we always have to deal with this fictitious neutrality and with the people who have different roles, being private persons, having their human rights against the state and representing at the same time the state. And that's where I hand over to Cathérine.
Thank you very much, Professor Nussberger. So what I want to add is that while neutrality is a fiction and we treat it as that, religious affiliations can be very different. So there might be an interest for a pluralistic state to exclude in public schools teachings by persons holding categorical views in order to avoid children being indoctrinated without giving them a chance to escape. An argument that also surfaces in this context of Vedeland and others versus Sweden, although in the context of freedom of expression. Seen against this background, the prohibition of religious dress and symbols can be understood as a compromise. The advantage would be that stronghold religious positions are not seen from the outset, thus avoiding potential conflicts. But as Professor Nussberger already mentioned, the disadvantage would be that the fact that someone is not wearing religious clothing or symbols does not change the positions that person holds. And thus it increases in transparency. The symbol does not say anything about the message or content of what that person teaches. Then for some religions, symbols and visibility are a byproduct. For others, they are more central. Some allow for a division between religious life in a private setting and religious life when working in the service of the state. Others don't. In Western Europe, the majority of human rights cases in this field thus concern minority religions who have a more outward expression, such as, for example, Muslims or Sikhs. A very important issue that was already mentioned, I think, by Stijn as well, is the jurisprudence of the Federal Constitutional Court of Germany. There, in its nuanced judgment on teachers' freedom of religion, the court does not allow a prohibition of religious symbols unless there is a concrete sign of conflict, which is a very problematic approach because the scope of religious freedom is limited or defined by those who want to create conflict. So what we see in Bavaria is that this has actually been dealt with in a quite pragmatic way. The crucifix is still on the wall. It was never really implemented, but a modus vivendi was found, providing for the possibility to take away the crucifix in case someone would complain about it or indeed cause conflict. What we see also is that in some cases, it has been discussed today already, that this demand of living up to this fiction of neutrality and taking off or hiding symbols and religious clothing is extended not only to persons representing the state, but also to persons not representing the state. So as such, it has been argued to include pupils in schools or parties, witnesses and victims at court. So while convincing justifications can be put forward for upholding this fiction of state neutrality with regards to actors with some kind of decision-making power, however small this decision-making power may be, these justifications mostly lose their persuasiveness when it comes to persons making use of a service provided by the state. So the proposed justifications we've seen here are the prevention of conflicts and also this necessity to show respect. For example, in Hamidovic versus Bosnia-Herzegovina, we see indeed that the European Court of Human Rights distinguishes between public officials who have this duty of discretion, neutrality and impartiality, but says on the other hand, such a duty normally should not apply to private citizens. This is something the court also did in Lachiri versus Belgium. They agreed in a similar vein that as the applicant was not a representative of the state, engaged in the exercise of a public service, she was not bound by any duty of discretion in the exercise of her religious beliefs. A small detail I want to add there is that in a dissenting opinion, Judge Moreau Wikström actually argued that we should pay attention to the specific context of this judicial ritual, which aims to erase personal differences of each person in order to place the legal and judicial debate at the heart of the trial. So for her, the respect for neutrality trumps the right of an individual to manifest one's religion. And she believes indeed that parties are not exempt from this obligation, as was the case in Lachiri. So this argument of erasing personal differences is one that you could easily see surface in an education context as well. For example, if we think of students' uniforms, although I think it does fail to convince. If school is understood as a preparation for adult life in society, it is unclear why it should function as an abstract space that is different from a real pluralistic environment. It is exactly in order to protect both students and their parents' religious freedoms that teachers are the principal addressee of this laïcité neutrality imperative. It seems that such interferences could only be justifiable under very specific circumstances. And those circumstances would have to entail that there is indeed an interference or that the rights of freedom of religion of others are being infringed upon. So only when an actual real risk is posed could such bans be tolerated. And to this extent, I want to mention that, and it has been happening a few times today, an abstract definition or comparison of certain religious symbols and their nature cannot take place. Indeed, like we have seen, scholars such as Pirik and Van der Burg, as well as Parek in the United Kingdom, have suggested a contextually sensitive application of neutrality is needed. And it is a complex assignment, but it reminds us every time that neutrality is merely, and again, I'm quoting, I think, Pirik, a derivative ideal or a fiction that can only be used as a justification when it serves other aims. And indeed, it has been mentioned a few times today by both Professor Smet and by Sir Malcolm Evans. It's a means, it's not an end. And that's something we need to remember. So when considering whether maintaining a fiction of neutrality holds as an argument for the prohibition of religious dress and symbols in public education, certain elements will be decisive. And that's the aim for maintaining the fiction, the individual targeted, whether it's a teacher, student, administrative staff, the activity they are doing, the level of schooling, and indeed there's also space for the historical interaction in certain states with majority or minority religion in public schools. And I wanted to say, I'm very curious to see how the European Court of Human Rights will deal with this in the Mikyas versus Belgium judgment, where they will zoom in on the headscarf in public education in the Belgian context. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Excellent talk of both of you. Thank you so much. Angelika, we wish you all the best. Please be recovered very soon, because we need you definitely also having you here in conferences next month. Yeah, let us move quickly, because lack of time, quickly to Jenny. Well, you are well known in our areas on secular and neutral Lutheran Protestantism. It is quite intriguing issue indeed. And
no, let's see.
The marination is quite nice term you used, marination. So yes, we are going to the kitchen of secular.
Thank you very much for inviting me here. It's very interesting to be here. I would like to start to say that I don't have a background in law. I come from religious studies background, and specifically history of religions, which you will probably note in this. Okay. This thing. Okay, now. Okay. So, Sweden is one of the most secular countries in the world, but also the most multi-religious in Europe. The self-image of the Swedish school system and of Swedish society in general is one of objectivity and neutrality. In this paper, I will argue that religion education in Sweden can be understood as both deeply Lutheran, but also neutral and objective. In doing this, I will put not only Swedish religion education, but also the Swedish educational system in a historical context, pointing to its relation to liberal theology and cultural Protestantism. Sweden's population is estimated at 10 million, and the state is often characterized as a welfare state, based on a model with state institutions distributing social service at the same time as private sector is maintained. This is important for our discussion, since schools, both public and so-called independent schools, are free of charge and financed by the state through taxes. Universities too are free of charge, and religious organizations can obtain financial support for some of their activities. In this welfare state model, the educational system has been a central institution, from the late 19th century aimed at including the whole population. In 1860, conversion from the Lutheran state church was legalized, on condition that one entered another religious congregation, but it was not until 1951 that Swedish citizens enjoyed freedom from religion without losing their citizenship. In 1956, Sweden initiated the process of separating the state from the church, a process that was completed in 2000. I use the term religion education instead of religious education. The reason is that I find it necessary to distinguish between the different ways that religion is taught in Europe. In other words, the term religion education is a choice made to illustrate that Swedish school subjects officially non-denominational, non-confessional character that is based on a religious studies approach. Religion education in Sweden has no special status. It is a school subject like all other school subjects. It is compulsory for all since 1996, no opt-out, like maths, history, physical education, or home economics. And it teaches about different religions then. The compulsory nature of Swedish religion education is intended to be in line with the European Convention on Human Rights, as long as Sweden can guarantee, I quote, information be conveyed in an objective and pluralistic manner. This character of religion education in Sweden has not been uncontroversial. It has been questioned from denominational points of view. Members of various religious denominations of different strands have argued that non-denominational religion education is not education about religion and religions from a neutral point of view, but rather education into atheism and secularism. This is an argument that has been used to justify the right for parents to establish schools based on their own religious conviction by reference to the European Convention on Human Rights. The Swedish school system has a long history of Christian religious instruction linked to the former Lutheran state church. Religious instruction was the most important school subject until a major curricular revision in 1919, the starting point of what may be called the secularization of Swedish schools. A transformation that was driven by representatives of liberal theology and cultural Protestantism, Neo-Protestantism also called. The idea was that liberal theology could offer a liberal science-based alternative to both Pentecostalism, which had in recent decades become well-established in Sweden, and the conservative layers in the state church. In addition, Neo-Protestantism was presented as an alternative to social democracy, which at this time was often viewed as leading to atheism. Later, however, when the Swedish Social Democrats came into office, they instead became partners in the process of transforming education. In other words, we can understand the school system is deeply marinated in Lutheran Protestantism. As the 20th century proceeded, ongoing social changes led to demands to further reduce the Christian emphasis in schools. In 1962, education in Swedish schools was named non-denominational. The school subject Christianity was renamed Knowledge About Christianity, and it was stipulated that the teaching should be neutral and objective in terms of religion. Objectivity requirements meant that teachers should also teach about other religions and should not, under any circumstances, influence the teacher's beliefs. This can also be understood in terms of our marinade metaphor. Although deeply soaked in Lutheran Protestantism, the confessional Lutheran teaching was wiped off and more facts-based school subjects introduced. In 1969, the subject's name was again changed to religionskunskap, knowledge about religions. The change in name confirms the transition from a denominational to a non-denominational school subject that prioritizes teaching about religion, including different religions. This can be understood as a try to wash away the last Lutheran marinade, thereby making an attempt to firmly establish religion education as a neutral and objective subject. But as we will see, not only are humans all colored by culture, history, and language, but also school subjects. And marinades may be washed away, but the taste remains. During the 80s and 90s, Swedish society became increasingly multicultural. The increased diversity and pluralism was reflected in both the syllabus for religion education and the national curriculum for the period. In the syllabus, teaching about non-Christian religions has been given more emphasis. In order to weld together all students and teachers, despite their different cultural backgrounds, the curriculum of 1994 introduced values education in a new way. Values such as freedom, equality, and solidarity were, and still are, presented as the foundation that school should rest on. Everyone in school, both adults and children, should work to ensure that these fundamental values are imparted and instilled in all subjects. The present national curriculum contains the following statement: the inviolability of human life, individual freedom and integrity, the equal value of all people, equality between women and men, and solidarity with the weak and vulnerable are the values that the school should represent and impart. In accordance with the ethics born by Christian tradition and Western humanism, this is achieved by fostering in the individual a sense of justice, generosity of spirit, tolerance, and responsibility. Teaching in the school should be non-denominational. In Swedish, it's icke-konfessionell, that is non-confessional, but this is the official translation. In accordance with Sweden's Education Act, the values outlined in the above quotation are meant to be achieved in all schools, both public and independent schools. On top of these fundamental values, all schools have to reach the goals of national syllabi in all school subjects, including religion education. In pursuit of these aims, schools with denominational profiles, Jewish, Christian, Muslim schools, can arrange a small number of hours per week for the introduction of their own religious instruction. In, for example, Muslim schools, which is one of my main subjects of research, this number amounts to 1 to 3 hours per week of Islamic religious education. The objectivity and neutrality of education is thus of importance regardless of a school's profile. Independent schools with a denominational focus may have confessional elements in part of the education that is not obligatory teaching, where teaching is defined as such goal-oriented process that under the guidance of teachers or preschool teachers aim at development and learning through the acquisition and development of knowledge and values. And education is defined as the activity within which teaching takes place on the basis of specific goals. Education is thus a broader concept and includes teaching, but also other activities such as breaks, excursions, school meals, etc. However, the participation of pupils in confessional elements must be voluntary. Back to the value foundation. The reference to ethics born by Christian tradition and Western humanism in the national curriculum has provoked debate, since the curriculum also states that education should be non-denominational. The use of the term non-denominational in the quotation is meant to imply that in the Swedish school system, education is to be implemented in such a way that no particular worldview is prioritized, and students from all cultural, ethnic, and religious backgrounds would feel comfortable to attend. This, however, does not extend to the realm of the fundamental values, the mediation of which the national curriculum considers a primary task of Sweden's educational system. One way of understanding the contradiction is by acknowledging the history of liberal theology in the development of modern Swedish education. It contributed to the secularization of education in the sense of a growing division between state and church matters by promoting a science-based education. But it also contributed to what has been described as a sacralization of the state and a reconstituted relation between Christianity and the state. Cultural Protestantism in Sweden has thus, among other forces, contributed to the independence of modern schooling from church institution. The fostering of good Christians was the aim of the school system up until the beginning of the 19th century. And in the 20th and 21st centuries, the foremost goal has instead become to foster good citizens, which the paragraph about fundamental values is an example of. In light of the Protestant model of secularization, these fundamental values can be understood as an example of the sacralization of the state. The argument for this would be that to claim a certain value foundation independent of religion is as much an expression of faith as any religion, since it makes a truth claim that is binding for everyone. While some degree of religious diversity has always existed in Swedish society over the last few decades, the ethnic and cultural composition of the country has undergone rapid transformation. Today, Sweden is not only the most secular countries in the world, but as I said, also one of the most multi-religious. Although the self-image of the Swedish school system is one of secularity, objectivity, and neutrality, it may also be understood as Lutheran, not only in terms of the factual history of the country, but also in terms of how people think and talk about religion in society, how religion is taught and holidays are celebrated in schools, how institutions are built in society, who gets subsidized by the state, etc. Sweden is thus a society that can be described as marinated in Lutheran Christianity, officially claiming to have washed away the marinade, but having problems in admitting that the taste abides. Thank you much for listening.
Thank you. It is quite relevant indeed to be informed on the specific Swedish secular model on education. Thank you so much. And the more you can rely on your huge experience of leading lady of the platform on religious education, research on religious education and on religion education Europe-wide. So we welcome you on Wednesday, Thursday and Friday on the conference in Antwerp on Islam in education and education of Islam, because you are one of the specialists in it of Muslim schools and Islamic schools throughout Europe. Thanks so much again. Ben Vermeulen is a member of the Council of State, professor in Amsterdam, professor in Radboud University, and a prominent member of the European Education Law Association. Yes, Ben, you have the floor.
Thanks, Jan. I'm very happy to be here and to be in a live conference talking about a topic which has been at the center of my life for as long as I live, I think. The question of what religion is and what, for instance, the reaction of the law as to religion should be is a fundamental one and a very fascinating one. We've heard very important things today, and I'm still in the process of digesting them. So it is difficult to ask useful questions. Nevertheless, I'll try to do so. The first question would be as to Jeroen Temperman. Jeroen, you have given a plea for, I think, religion education, which is education about religion. It is not religious instruction. And I assume that that should be a topic within public schools. It is necessary to do so. My first question is, do you indeed think that public schools, and I assume that you mean by public schools, schools which are the primary responsibility of the state, so I equate more or less public schools with state schools. Do you believe that state schools have to teach about religion? And if so, for what reason? And my second question is your preferred model, which is the public school, I would say state school, that gives instruction about religion, teaches about religion and does not allow for any opting out. How does that fit in? Does that fit in the neutrality principle that most states more or less adhere to? I have furthermore questions about the second lecture, which was very challenging for me. The state as merely a conglomerate of individuals. I'm not sure whether that would be my view. And it was connected with the notion of neutrality as a fiction. And that probably flows, but maybe I am incorrect, from the assumption that the state only acts through individuals. Cathérine, what you're saying is if an individual is acting on behalf of the state, it nevertheless remains a person with its own ideals, and that cannot ipso facto be neutral. My question is that correct? Is that the correct interpretation of the neutrality principle? Of course, neutrality itself is not a neutral concept. It's a debated concept, and it is used as a weapon, as a moral weapon, as a shield, as a guarantee, but also as a sword. But maybe we can say there is some core element in the neutrality principle that is generally acceptable, and it has to do with equality and pluralism. And if we see it as one of the values connected with equality, pluralism, maybe also minority protection, then I would say that the notion of neutrality is not that connected with the individual beliefs. I think we could say that these are essential legal values that have to be upheld. So I have some problems with the idea of the fiction of neutrality. There you're using neutrality in, I believe, in terms of mentality. But neutrality is also an overarching legal principle that we probably cannot miss. My final question would be to Jenny, which we've been talking about it yesterday already and this morning, and I'm really puzzled by the notion of neutral education being marinated in Lutheranism. And my first maybe simple question is it then still neutral? Does it still fulfill the criteria of equality, pluralism, even-handedness, and so on? And the second question is, you're speaking also from an historical development point of view, and are saying, well, this notion of non-ideological or non-denominational education about religion is itself a product to a certain extent of the history of Sweden, which is embedded in Lutheranism. And my question is, would it be possible to put aside that marination? Is it possible to have a purely, in fact, neutral way of teaching about religions? Jan, I've tried to summarize a few points. I've many more questions.
Yes, sir.
Due to the time limit,
Yeah.
we have to be. I try to be concise.
Thanks, Ben. Jeroen.
Thanks. See, yes, thanks.
Female power.
Thanks very much. Yeah. So thanks very much for these comments and questions. And indeed, I absolutely made a plea for religion education in a non-confessional sense, or teaching about the different religions present in a country, the different religions that are important to the country at stake, including non-religious faiths. And I think, I mean, essentially you could summarize my position by saying I want the Swedish model for all countries. I think that would be, if that would have made my presentation a 1-minute presentation, Stein would have been very happy with that. But it's, but at the moment, and I think that was the undercurrent of the presentation, this type of model, Sweden, or as I call it, the TGP, the Toledo Guiding Principles style teaching, is an option among many other options, and it coexists among the many other options. It's not even the default, it's the preferred options under the Toledo Guiding Principles, but even there it coexists among other options. And so that means that we have a reality where Sweden very much is an exception, and I would like to see that TGP style teaching really takes off, you know, in Europe and even beyond, far more massively. Is that likely? No. I think the social legal argument I present is a very strong one, but I don't think for instance, the European Court of Human Rights will be easily persuaded by that argument. I think, especially post Brighton movement and with the marginalization or the margin of appreciation of the court, if that's a word. That's the court is not going to burn its fingers on such a hot potato. So I don't see it readily happen other than in the legal doctrine and in the comments. So that's, I think, is the pessimistic note there, but can only try there. On the no opt-outs is not very neutral. Yes, yeah, and I mean I agree, and also the Toledo Guiding Principles, they are pro opt-outs, and so it's I think standing alone there maybe. But my point, and it was the last point, I think this argument even stronger than one by the European Court of Human Rights, saying that, you know, if it passes the critical and objective, etc. test, then you don't need opt-outs. I think the stronger argument there to be made is that essentially education as a notion on the international human rights law is a very, very value-loaded concept. It's not a neutral concept. It's not an empty concept. It's full of agendas and even propaganda. It's a pro-human rights propaganda instrument. It is even an instrument. It's literally an instrument in the Children's Rights Convention to persuade impressionable young people to be pro-human rights and democracy and rule of law and all those jolly hockey sticks. So I think that would be my argument there, and that's sort of that angle I very much support.
Just an issue, very shortly. You know the Belgian model, where in public schools there is a variety of choices. A variety of choices of religious instruction in the recognized religions, 2 hours a week, and there is now a statement within one of the communities in Belgium pleading for 1 hour of religious instruction and a second hour on instruction about education about religions. This coexistence, do you think that will be a valuable option?
So I would argue that's a viable option in denominational schools, and so I think nothing of what I said should prejudice the whole realm, private realm we have of denominational schools, where I think that combination would be interesting. But of course, it's a free space, so it's up to the schools to have that second hour or not. But I don't see it as a viable option within public schools for precisely these pluralist and diversity kind of arguments. Yeah.
Room for debate in Belgium, yes, definitely. Catrina.
Yeah, this one.
Catrine.
Okay. Yeah, so I don't know if Professor Nussberger wants to respond, who is in Cologne, but I will briefly.
Yes, we hope to meet her very soon in couple of seconds, yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so but I will first go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the main idea is that when we speak of neutrality of a certain organization, is that an organization on its own is comprised of individuals and it acts through individuals. And very often in the case law of the court, we exactly see that this, of the European Court of Human Rights, we see that this neutrality principle is used as some kind of weapon against an individual's exercise of their rights. So what we then require is for an individual to align with a principle of neutrality that was not really the reason why it's created. And that's something that I added and where I referred to what Professor Smet and Sir Malcolm Evans said as well, is that neutrality is only a means that we use towards an end. And indeed, like you said, it is indeed connected with equality and pluralism, because one of the most important goals, I think, for neutrality is to have equality. And in that sense, it serves to make this principle of equality between individuals and this right to be treated equal, to fill this in some way in a state practice. But the neutrality on its own is not the principle in se, I think. So something where this is very clear is, for example, if you look at, because we've been discussing courts and schools, but if you look at the way civil servants in certain Belgian cities are required to interact with their citizens, you see that some cities say that indeed what we call a neutral interaction by excluding certain religious symbols actually does not have the impact that we want, namely that we give this impression to citizens that they're going to be treated equally. Taking away this appearance or this almost like smoke screen of neutrality about someone's appearance is not going to have an impact on the way individuals interact with the organizations or the people that represent the state in these cases. So we see that certain cities say, no, indeed, we want to have this principle of neutrality where people are not allowed to wear religious symbols in their interactions with citizens, but also cities that say it does not make sense, it doesn't have an impact on the way they act, whether or not they are wearing a headscarf or a cap or something like this. And there they go for taking away this as an extra layer of smoke screen neutrality is what I like to call it. But I think maybe Professor Nussberger has something else to say to that.
Angelika, Prof. Nussberger, are you still with us?
Yes, I'm with you. I'm listening. Do you hear me?
Yeah, perfectly.
Okay. Yeah, just to add one sentence, Benjamin said that neutrality is for him, he doesn't follow us, that we see the state as a multiplicity of individuals, and he calls neutrality an overarching legal principle. But I just think that these cases about the symbols, about the religious symbols, show that it's not only an overarching legal principle, but when you zoom in on the conflicts, you see that the state is, the individual is on both sides. The individual is on the side of the state, and the individual is on the side of him or herself having different opinions. And that is the interesting tension in all those cases, I think. And I think it doesn't help to take neutrality only as an abstract legal principle. We have to look at it in this conflict situation as well. Just to add that, thank you.
Thank you so much. Keep safe, please.
Yeah.
Be blessed.
Thank you.
Yeah, Jenny.
Okay. This one works better. Okay, thank you very much. And thanks for your questions. And no, I don't think that the Protestant marinade can be washed away. And I actually don't think that that is very desirable. Because, I mean, my problem is that we are not admitting it. And wherever you teach, of course, the school system is marinated in the culture that you have in each country. And I think the important thing is to acknowledge it instead of saying, you know, that it's objective, objective and so on. It should be as objective as possible, as neutral as possible in the study of religions perspective. And this also has to do with teacher training. I mean, I teach a lot of those who are going to become teachers in religion education at upper secondary schools, for example. They have to take history of religions and so on, learn about different religious tradition. But of course, they will all come from one. I mean, my students would be Muslims, Orthodox, Christian, Protestant, secularist, atheist, everything, and so on. And I think I always demand of everyone to take a step back from their own religious tradition, because they're going to teach about different. And that is actually most difficult for the ones who are very much the secular Swedes. I mean, the Muslim students, the Orthodox Christian students who come from the Middle East, they know they have to take a step back from that tradition if they're going to try to teach about different religions objectively. But that is very difficult for many students who of a secular background. They also have to take a step back and see that what does that bring to their teaching of religion. So that is often a challenge, because they often have the idea that they are the most neutral and can't really see that they have very deeply this Lutheran marinade that I would argue that they have. So I think that yeah, as neutral as possible and taking a step back. And I think it is a very good thing. I agree with you on that, you know, teaching about, learning about. But also, I don't think that we should think that the teaching about religions is, you know, I fully support my school subject. I think that this is a very good thing for all schools. But I don't think it's going to you know, be revolutionary in terms of social cohesion or tolerance or so on within schools. Because, I mean, there is actually no research that supports that the Swedish system gives more tolerant pupils than any other school system. What we have research that supports is actually that there is a lot of conditions that needs to be met, that students need to meet each other and do things together to kind of accept each other's differences and so on. And I think actually that if religion education is taught badly, it's better that, you know, if you have the goal of getting social cohesion and tolerance and so on in society, it's better to go and play football together. You know, not but if it's taught in a very good way, if there is a good teacher education, if you have the right conditions, and that you cannot prioritize or downplay, which we sometimes see, any specific, then it's good. But there's a lot of factors more than that, than writing a curriculum that is somewhat neutral. You know, there's much more that needed.
Yeah. Thanks. We still have some minutes from the audience, raising questions from the audience. Yes, please. Do you want this one? Do you want this mic? Please take this mic.
Thank you. I'd like to ask a question to Jenny Berglund. I share Jeroen's enthusiasm for the Swedish model. And please take no offense in this, but I've been itching for a case to arise from Sweden to the European Court of Human Rights in hopes that it would help clarify lots of loose ends that Folgero leaves, right? To really tease out what we mean by how critical must it be, how objective, how pluralistic, and you just said as possible, and I found that very interesting. Now, when a case arose from Greece, where I come from, Papageriou, I was also very excited, and I thought finally we're going to have the opportunity for the court to lay out the boundaries and explain and tease out the difficulties around that, including also who teaches, like you were just explaining. But the court failed us there. It completely sidetracked that question and only dealt with opt-outs and didn't deal at all with the content of the course. Whereas in this course, I know personally how hard a lot of theologians have worked trying to make it as critical, as pluralistic, as objective as possible. And they were talking in terms of baby steps that need to be taken, because in the Greek context, they were saying, you know, you have to take baby steps, otherwise the state will close it down. Well, that's what's happened in the end. In the end, the state has closed down religious education. We have, you know, I think Jeroen's worst result from the models that you've shown of a religious denominational now teaching with easy opt-outs. So my question is, to what extent do you think it's possible we might ever see a case arising from the Swedish context, or do you think it's foolproof? And I also would ask you if you could to weigh kind of, because I think you've communicated an understanding, or your feeling that the marinade will remain, the taste will always remain, and that's okay. And I wondered if you could kind of weigh that, speaking to what Malcolm said also in terms of the importance of contextualization, what it is for a student in Sweden to be taught religion in a way that that marinade, that taste remains, as compared to maybe a student in Italy seeing the cross, the crucifix on the wall.
Shereed?
Thank you. Thank you all very much. It's been really interesting. Slight disclaimer, one of the most fascinating things I've done in recent years was being co-opted for 2 years to exploration of religious education by the Religious Education Council in the UK, where I was the only lawyer in the room, surrounded by educationalists, sociologists and others. And it was a fascinating learning experience. And one of the questions I want to raise really arises out of that, you know, and really to start off with Jenny, certainly in the UK there is a bit of a myth about the practical end of delivery. We can talk about curricula from now till to eternity, but at the end of the day, going back to what others have said, they are delivered by people, and teacher training in relation to this. You know, I think we sometimes assume that if you get the curriculum right, then magically it will be delivered in an appropriate way. But certainly in the UK, there's brilliant teacher training for those who go into religious education, but the vast bulk of the compulsory religious education, which is not the optional units, is actually just delivered by general teachers who've had just a handful of hours training around this. And in truth, some of the stuff that they say, with the best will in the world, because they don't know any better, is just nonsense. And, you know, some of, at least, of the people wanting to opt their children out of religious education is simply because they don't want them to be taught things which are just completely nonsensical and embarrassing. I'll give you one example that I ran into of, you know, a general education going out saying, what was it? Sikhs go to gurdwaras, Muslims go to mosques, Christians go to mass. Now, which levels of misunderstanding and who is most badly represented by that, we can discuss forever. But the point is that one can see that perhaps sometimes it's not so much the curriculum, but the failure to get the right teaching training in place can drive some of these problems. And that goes back to hop over to what Jeroen was saying at that point. You know, I've always taken the view, I'm in the ideal world, I wouldn't like opt-outs from TGP style things, but to me, I suppose it just provides a useful safety valve for those very rare occasions when things just do go wrong. And certainly the evidence I know from within the UK suggests that in reality, most schools don't even know there is a possibility of an opt-out. It hardly ever happens. And on the rare occasions when someone does actually think about an opt-out, what happens in the real world is the head of the school tends to speak to the parent, what's going on is explained, and it never occurs. So is the debate about opt-outs itself runs the risk of adding to polarization around this, whereas it could actually be dealt with in those instances where it is a genuine issue in another way that didn't polarize the debate.
Kurt, Professor? Question or comment?
I could, but now we're in the afternoon and we're already 15 minutes behind schedule, so perhaps I can leave my comments till after.
Okay, we'll do it. Okay, very short reply from the panel, starting with Jen.
Yes, in terms of Swedish, I don't think it will be the religion education that will be brought to the Court of Human Rights. I think it will be issues around the denominational schools that will come, because there are now politically there has been a suggestion to not to close the ones existing, but to not permit any new ones to come. And I think that will, in relation to the religion education, be brought. And then I totally agree on you know, I've been quite a lot to the UK and discussed about religious education, because we both have the denominational models. I think that how you can see that it's marinated in Lutheran Protestantism, which was one question as well. It's, for example, if you look at the textbook in Sweden, and you see how different religions are presented. There is always the man, the book, and the faith, which is a very Protestant way of describing what religion is. And then you put that on all other world religions. So you would put it, man, the book, the faith, on Islam, on Judaism, on Buddhism, and Hinduism. And yes, of course, you can do that. But that brings about these, yeah, the man, the book, and the faith, they have different places in theology within the different religious traditions. So it becomes a very strange way of presenting a religion. But I don't think that we can change that really, because if you would go to another context and you would present in another way, which would, and then you would put that on Protestantism or some others. So, you know, it's just that making teacher students aware of this so that they can teach, as I said, as neutral as possible. And I totally agree that the opt-out clause, I mean, it's no opt-out in Sweden, and that is sometimes problematic, because we have a lot of people who are not educated, who do teach also religion education, and a lot of interesting, fascinating things, yeah, scary things come out of that, that you hear. So that might be a problem. Just,
I don't think anything was.
Yeah, just a couple of reflections on the many things that have just been said. So on the, yeah, let me first of all completely concur on the issue of the quality of the trainer courses, because it's absolutely key. And in the absence thereof, I mean, it all falls apart, and it will actually do more harm than good, the whole exercise. And indeed, I mean, there's no solid support yet from the literature that the teaching like this actually, you know, boosts tolerance and so on. And I mean, even in theory, or the quite opposite could be the dynamics, right? The more you learn about the religion, the more, or some religions, or the more intolerance could be caused on paper. But I think, and so now I'm back on the pulpit again, and the cause of the Toledo Guiding Principles. I think one thing that the Toledo Guiding Principles really get absolutely right is that the teaching about religion is also very much teaching about freedom of religion, teaching about respect for freedom of religion. Not so much teaching respect for religions per se, and you don't, I mean, there's no human rights obligation to have respect for religions. But so one of the undercurrents is that, you know, knowing and knowledge about religion might, you know, induce tolerance, but indeed that cannot be completely corroborated from literature. But more important, I think, is or as important is teaching about the right to freedom of religion or belief, which should be also part and parcel of these subjects. So the notion that, you know, you do not need to respect everybody, but you need to respect everyone's freedom to have those identities and those beliefs. Then on the sort of the obsession on opt-outs, yeah. So I think my game there is a larger one than the exact discussion on opt-outs, which I'm also very much interested in. My larger gameplay, if you will, is that you know, the moment opt-outs were to be out because they are really dismantled from a legal perspective, I think the dynamics then completely change, because then it becomes an all or nothing decision, also on the part of, you know, religious stakeholders. What do we want then in the public school curriculum? like silence on the issue of religion, or discussions about religions. And I think Foguereau there also is very meaningful, because Foguereau says that it stands completely to reason that if the overwhelming majority of the population adheres to one particular religion, that particular religion or faith gets a larger chunk in the curriculum. So numerically, completely fine. The moment things go wrong is if there's a qualitative emphasis in terms of, like the rituals that go alongside the teaching. So I think, I think my agenda there is inspired by that kind of dynamics, which I now put on record there.
Thanks so much. Let us honor this panel on the lovely way. And now we have the fundamental right to run for the lunch, including Angelika. Angelika, be happy. We will meet each other very soon again. And details on the lunch? Yeah, okay, 2:30.
Yeah, people in the room, you are free to leave your stuff here. We will reconvene at 2:30.
Yeah.